The hedgerows west of St. Lo remained shrouded in the morning fog on that 25th day of July in 1944, just past 9:30 in the morning. Through his field glasses, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein watched something that struck him as deeply unsettling. For 6 solid weeks since the Allied landings, American guns had maintained their relentless harassment. The constant pounding had become a perverse sort of background noise, an ever-present reminder of the industrial might arrayed against his Panzer Lehr division. But now, quite suddenly, the guns had fallen silent. Bayerlein was no amateur at this business of war. The men under his command had served with distinction in Rommel's Afrika Korps, where they'd learned firsthand what modern artillery could do to human flesh and steel. They'd survived Soviet barrages on the Eastern Front that seemed capable of reshaping the very landscape, thunder that rolled across the steppe like the wrath of vengeful gods. They'd endured British guns at El Alamein, where Montgomery had demonstrated his own appreciation for concentrated firepower. These veterans understood artillery in all its terrible forms, or so they believed. What happened at precisely 38 minutes past 9 that morning would shatter every assumption they'd made about the nature of artillery warfare. In that instant, more than 1,000 American artillery pieces spoke as one. This wasn't the familiar sequence of guns firing one after another, nor was it the rolling barrage that military doctrine had prescribed for generations. Every single gun fired simultaneously, and more remarkably still, every single shell arrived at its target at exactly the same moment. The projectiles had been launched from vastly different distances. Some batteries sat 6 miles behind the front lines, others 15 miles back, yet their shells converged with impossible precision. The variety of weapons contributing to this single moment defied comprehension. Light 105mm howitzers, those workhorses of American artillery, sent their shells arcing through the morning air. Medium 155mm guns added their deeper voices to the chorus. Heavy 8-inch howitzers, capable of throwing massive projectiles over extraordinary distances, participated in this carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. Even the colossal 240mm batteries, monsters that required entire crews to service, contributed their overwhelming power to this singular instant of violence. Artillery officers from any previous conflict would have deemed such coordination mathematically impossible. Each battery faced unique calculations. They needed to account for range and deflection, certainly, but the critical variable was time of flight. A 105mm shell fired at a high angle might require 23 seconds to reach its designated target. A 155mm long tom, positioned farther from the battle, might need 31 seconds to traverse the distance. The fire commands had been meticulously staggered backwards from the desired moment of impact, with each battery receiving orders to fire at precisely the calculated second that would ensure all shells arrived together. What awaited the German defenders wasn't merely another artillery barrage, another demonstration of American material superiority. They were about to experience something entirely new in the long history of warfare, a synthesis of industrial coordination, mathematical precision, and organizational capability applied to the ancient art of killing at distance. This was American industrial might made manifest in the most immediate and devastating way imaginable, and it would fundamentally alter German understanding of how modern wars would be fought. To properly grasp just how revolutionary this time-on-target technique truly was, one needs to understand where artillery doctrine stood in the middle of 1944. For centuries, gunners had followed predictable patterns established through generations of experience and refinement. Napoleon had massed his grande batteries, positioning guns wheel to wheel to fire in carefully orchestrated sequences. The Great War had introduced rolling barrages, where artillery fire walked ahead of advancing infantry at predetermined rates, a creeping wall of steel meant to suppress defenders, while friendly troops followed close behind. German doctrine had evolved through the interwar years into their concept of Schwerpunkt, the decisive point where overwhelming force would be concentrated to achieve breakthrough. German artillery had earned its reputation through victories across Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized rapid concentration and displacement, with forward observers working in close coordination with battery commanders to bring accurate fire on targets within minutes of identification. German officers took considerable pride in this flexibility and speed, seeing it as evidence of superior military professionalism. Their assessment of German artillery superiority wasn't entirely wrong, at least based on early encounters. American artillery in North Africa had struggled initially with coordination problems. At Kasserine Pass, that painful introduction to modern warfare against a professional enemy, dispersed American batteries had failed to concentrate their fire effectively, allowing German forces to exploit weaknesses and inflict embarrassing defeats on inexperienced American units. What German officers had failed to notice, however, was that the Americans were learning. More than learning, they were adapting and applying principles drawn from industrial management to the centuries-old practice of artillery. The development of time on target represented something more profound than tactical innovation. It reflected a fundamental shift in thinking about how artillery should function. Rather than viewing each battery as an independent unit supporting whatever local commander happened to need fire support, American planners had reconceptualized artillery as an integrated system, a coordinated network capable of delivering overwhelming force at precisely determined moments. The capacity to execute time-on-target barrages demanded four interconnected innovations, technological and organizational changes that the Germans hadn't fully comprehended, even as they began to experience the results. The first innovation involved the forward observer system itself. German forward observers, the Vorgeschobener Beobachter, typically worked with individual batteries, or at most a battalion of guns. American forward observers operated under an entirely different philosophy. A single FO could call upon entire artillery groups, even corps-level assets representing dozens of batteries spread across miles of terrain. Each American forward observer carried an SCR-609 radio, later upgraded to the improved SCR-610 model, providing reliable communication to fire direction centers positioned miles behind the front lines. These radios, the SCR-609 documented in technical manuals from April 1943, operated on FM frequencies between 27 and 38.9 MHz. The SCR-610, standardized in late September 1941, provided between 20 and 32 watts of output power with a dependable 5-mile range under typical conditions. The second innovation was perhaps even more significant. The Fire Direction Center, universally known by its initials FDC, represented a concept pioneered at Fort Sill during the 1930s and perfected through combat experience. The FDC functioned essentially as a mathematical computing center, where specially trained personnel employed firing tables, slide rules, and graphical firing boards to calculate firing solutions for multiple batteries operating simultaneously. This centralized calculation meant that a single observer's fire mission could be rapidly translated into firing data for every available gun within range. The third element supporting time on target was communication infrastructure of a scope that would have seemed excessive by traditional military standards. Americans laid telephone wire with what German observers characterized as manic intensity. A single infantry division might string 3,000 miles of telephone wire in just 1 month of active combat operations. These redundant communication networks, with multiple lines connecting every important node, ensured that fire missions could be transmitted instantaneously to dozens of batteries scattered across the battlefield. The fourth element, perhaps the most underappreciated by outside observers, was standardization. American ammunition was manufactured to demanding specifications in factories stretching from Pennsylvania to California. Any 105mm shell fired from any howitzer would exhibit predictable ballistic characteristics. The propellant charges burned at consistent rates, the shells weighed within tight tolerances, and the metallurgy was uniform. German ammunition, increasingly produced by slave labor in dispersed and often improvised facilities, showed growing variability as the war progressed. By 1944, German artillery officers had to test-fire new ammunition batches to determine their actual performance characteristics, while Americans could confidently assume their shells would perform exactly according to specification. German forces had their first encounter with limited time on target techniques in Italy during early 1944, though many officers dismissed what they observed as fortunate coincidences rather than deliberate tactical applications. The concentrated firepower achieved during the Anzio breakout on the 23rd of May provided the first large-scale demonstration that captured serious German attention. 16 battalions of artillery, representing over 200 guns, delivered what appeared to be perfectly coordinated fire on German positions along the Caesar line. The technique had been undergoing refinement through months of practice and experimentation. The 9th Infantry Division had conducted experimental time on target barrages in Sicily, learning through trial and error what worked and what didn't. The 1st Infantry Division, that storied formation with its big red one-shoulder patch, had further improved the technique during fighting in Italy. By D-Day, time on target had evolved from experimental tactic to standard doctrine, though German intelligence continued to dismiss reports of its effectiveness as typical American exaggeration. The 25th of July marked the beginning of Operation Cobra and the full, devastating unveiling of what American time-on-target capabilities had become. General Omar Bradley had concentrated the largest artillery force yet assembled by American arms in Europe. Over 1,000 tubes, ranging from the ubiquitous 105mm howitzers to massive 8-inch guns, with 522 guns from the 7th and 8th Corps alone, supplemented by 4.2-inch mortars and other supporting weapons. The target area, a rectangle roughly 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep stretching south of the Saint-Lô-Perrier road, contained the bulk of Panzer Lehr Division along with elements of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division. Approximately 5,000 combat troops occupied fortified positions in that confined space, veterans who'd prepared their defensive works with German thoroughness. At 38 minutes past 9 in the morning, following carpet bombing by heavy bombers that had already left the defenders stunned and reeling, every American gun fired. Shells launched from distances ranging from 5,000 to 25,000 yards converged on their targets in a single coordinated moment of annihilation. The U.S. Army had allocated 170,000 artillery shells for Operation Cobra, 140,000 for 7th Corps and 27,000 for 8th Corps, a concentration of firepower that defied traditional military thinking. The barrage proceeded in precise intervals, successive time on target concentrations walking methodically through German positions. Then came silence. Then American infantry advanced into positions that had simply ceased to exist as defensive works. Panzer Lehr, which had entered Normandy with 14,000 men and 190 tanks, essentially ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force division in the space of minutes. General Fritz Bayerlein provided his famous assessment to Field Marshal von Kluge, words that would be quoted in after-action reports and historical studies for decades to come. His front lines looked like the face of the moon, he reported, and at least 70% of his troops were out of action, whether dead, wounded, driven mad, or simply too shocked to function. The division that had represented one of Germany's premier armoured formations had been effectively destroyed by artillery alone. What German observers couldn't fully grasp was the mathematical precision underlying the time-on-target concept. This wasn't simply about firing large numbers of guns, something that armies had understood since the Napoleonic era. This was about solving extraordinarily complex ballistic equations in real time under combat conditions. Consider the fundamental problem. To make shells from different guns arrive at the same instant requires knowing multiple variables with precision. The exact location of each battery, measured to within 1 meter. The precise distance to the target, calculated along the actual curved path the shell would follow rather than simple map distance. the muzzle velocity of each gun type, which varied based on barrel wear and temperature, the weight and aerodynamic characteristics of each shell type, wind speed and direction at various altitudes as the shell traced its parabolic arc, air temperature and density affecting how the shell would fly. For very long-range fire, even the rotation of the Earth became a factor requiring compensation. Powder temperature affecting the rate at which propellant burned and thus the muzzle velocity achieved. Americans had developed graphical computation tools specifically designed to solve these problems rapidly. The graphical firing table, known as the GFT, and the graphical sight table, the GST, allowed trained personnel to calculate complex ballistic solutions in minutes rather than hours. German artillery, still relying on conventional firing tables and individual battery calculations performed by each gun crew, couldn't match this speed of coordination. The ability to execute time on target depended fundamentally on a communication network that exceeded anything the Germans had encountered in previous campaigns. By July 1944, a typical American infantry division in Normandy operated more radio sets than an entire German corps had possessed in 1940. The 1st Infantry Division alone operated over 900 radio sets by August, an almost incomprehensible number to German communications officers still struggling with limited and increasingly unreliable equipment. Every artillery battery maintained multiple redundant communication systems. Telephone wire-connected batteries to fire direction centres and higher headquarters. Radio provided backup when wire was cut by shell fire or destroyed by advancing armour. This communication superiority enabled something Germans found almost beyond comprehension: the ability to mass dispersed artillery instantaneously. American batteries didn't need physical concentration to achieve concentrated effect. Guns spread over 20 miles of front could converge their fire on a target mere hundreds of yards wide, achieving the devastating effect of massed batteries without the vulnerability of actual physical massing. The standardization of American production proved equally crucial. Every shell manufactured in American factories had identical ballistic characteristics. Whether a 105mm shell was produced in Pennsylvania or Missouri, it met exact specifications for weight, aerodynamic profile, and propellant charge. This standardization, achieved through mass production techniques refined in American industry, enabled the precise time-of-flight calculations required for time-on-target execution. German production, increasingly disrupted by strategic bombing and reliant on dispersed manufacturing using forced labor, couldn't achieve such consistency. Shells produced in different facilities might vary enough in weight or propellant quality to significantly affect ballistic performance. Artillery officers had to account for these variations, adding another layer of complexity to already difficult calculations. The American capacity to mass-produce not just weapons, but trained personnel astounded German professionals who studied their opponents' organizational methods. The U.S. Army's Fire Direction Center training program at Fort Sill, the primary artillery training center in Oklahoma, graduated thousands of qualified FDC personnel throughout the war years. Young men who'd been civilians mere months earlier emerged capable of calculating complex fire missions under pressure. The German counter-offensive at Mortain, launched on the 7th of August, provided a devastating demonstration of American time-on-target capabilities employed in defensive operations. Hitler had ordered a massive counterattack designed to cut off the American breakthrough at Avranches, committing rebuilt formations, including the 2nd SS Panzer Division, 1st SS Panzer Division, and 116th Panzer Division. As German armour concentrated for the attack, American forward observers watched from Hill 317, their elevated position providing excellent observation of German assembly areas. When the German assault began at midnight, those observers called for time-on-target missions on coordinates they'd carefully registered during daylight hours. The 2nd Infantry Division alone fired up to 20 separate time-on-target missions in a single night, according to official after-action reports. The American 30th Infantry Division, though outnumbered by the attacking German forces, called in time-on-target missions from 7 separate artillery battalions throughout the night of battle. Each mission delivered instantaneous devastation on German assembly areas, approach routes, and command posts. The concentrated firepower created what surviving German soldiers described as solid walls of hot steel that made forward movement impossible. By dawn, the German attack had completely stalled. Field Marshal von Kluge reported directly to Hitler that continuation of the offensive was militarily impossible against such artillery superiority. Divisions that had begun the attack with confidence found themselves shattered by artillery fire delivered with a precision and speed that defied their experience. The ability to execute time-on-target missions routinely represented a remarkable training achievement that extended far beyond simple technical proficiency. The US Army had transformed millions of civilians into skilled practitioners of complex military science in less than 3 years. At Fort Sill, the Field Artillery School had developed intensive programs that compressed decades of accumulated artillery knowledge into 17-week courses. Students learned ballistics, the mathematical principles governing how projectiles fly through the atmosphere. They studied meteorology, understanding how weather conditions affected shell trajectories. They mastered survey techniques for precisely locating gun positions and targets. They learned communications procedures and equipment operation. Most importantly, they learned to conceptualize artillery as an integrated system rather than collections of individual guns. The training emphasized practical application over theoretical knowledge. Students performed thousands of simulated fire missions, calculating time-on-target solutions repeatedly until the process became automatic. By graduation, a competent FDC team could calculate a 10-battery time-on-target mission in under 180 seconds, from receiving the fire mission to transmitting firing data to all participating batteries. This mass production of technical expertise astounded German professionals who encountered it. Americans trained more fire direction specialists in 3 years than Germany had produced in decades of professional military development. The Americans approached military education like factory production, standardized, efficient, and infinitely scalable. The execution of time on target required not just skill, but overwhelming material resources. A single time-on-target mission might expend more ammunition than a German division received in an entire month. During Operation Cobra alone, American artillery fired the 170,000 rounds allocated for the operation in a matter of hours. The logistical systems supporting this expenditure delivered thousands of tons of ammunition daily to forward positions. Trucks ran continuously from Normandy beaches to battery positions, creating an unbroken chain of supply that operated 24 hours daily. Ammunition dumps were established at multiple echelons, ensuring batteries never ran short of shells. The quality of American ammunition also surpassed German expectations, built on observing earlier American performance. Each shell was manufactured to exacting tolerances, with consistent propellant quality, ensuring predictable muzzle velocities and precise weight distribution guaranteeing predictable ballistic flight. This standardization enabled the accurate time-of-flight calculations absolutely essential for time-on-target execution. German ammunition, by contrast, showed increasing variability as the war progressed and production conditions deteriorated. Artillery officers had to conduct test firings of new ammunition batches to determine actual velocity and range characteristics, while Americans could confidently assume their shells would perform exactly to published specifications. One aspect of time on target that particularly impressed German artillery officers who survived to study the technique was American mastery of meteorological effects on ballistics. Accurate time-on-target execution required precise knowledge of wind speeds at various altitudes, air pressure, temperature, and humidity. These atmospheric conditions significantly affected how shells flew, potentially throwing off calculations by hundreds of yards. The Americans had deployed an extensive meteorological service specifically supporting artillery operations. Every corps maintained weather sections, taking atmospheric readings every 30 minutes throughout the day and night. Radio sonde devices, weather balloons equipped with radio transmitters, provided atmospheric data up to 30,000 feet altitude. This information was immediately distributed to all fire direction centers, allowing them to incorporate current atmospheric conditions into their ballistic calculations. This attention to atmospheric conditions enabled American artillery to maintain accuracy even in rapidly changing weather. During the November offensive in the Hurtgen Forest, American time-on-target missions maintained precision despite fog, rain, and variable winds that would have disrupted German artillery operating with less sophisticated meteorological support. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest demonstrated that time-on-target could prove devastatingly effective even in dense woodland that Germans had considered largely proof against artillery fire. The Americans developed specialized tree-burst time-on-target missions, timing shells to detonate in the forest canopy rather than on the ground. In November 1944, the 4th Infantry Division attacking through the forest called for time-on-target missions using mixed ammunition, high-explosive shells for blast and fragmentation combined with white phosphorus shells for incendiary effect. The coordinated tree burst created what survivors described as instant hell. Wood splinters were driven downward like spears, mixed with burning phosphorus that ignited the forest floor and created smoke that suffocated men in their foxholes. The 28th Infantry Division, attacking toward Schmidt through some of the forest's densest sections, used time-on-target barrages to clear German strongpoints that had resisted conventional attacks. One particularly concentrated mission on the 6th of November involved 12 battalions, 144 guns, firing into a 500-meter square area. They delivered over 3,000 shells in 30 seconds. German positions that had held for weeks were obliterated in half a minute. The dense woods that had seemed to offer protection actually magnified the horror, as the trees themselves became weapons. The woods also muffled sound propagation, meaning shells arrived with even less warning than in open terrain. German medical services documented unprecedented rates of what they termed artillery-induced psychological trauma among Hurtgen Forest veterans. Soldiers who'd remained functional after experiencing conventional bombardments on the Eastern Front found themselves psychologically broken by the coordinated devastation of time-on-target missions in the claustrophobic forest environment. The encirclement of German forces in the Falaise Pocket during August 1944 provided perhaps the most concentrated demonstration of time-on-target effectiveness in the European campaign. As German units struggled desperately to escape through the narrowing gap between converging Allied forces, American artillery delivered continuous time-on-target missions on every escape route. On the 17th of August alone, American artillery executed documented time-on-target missions on the Falaise-Argentan road at 30-minute intervals throughout daylight hours. Each mission involved 10 to 15 batteries, delivering coordinated devastation on German columns attempting to flee the collapsing pocket. General Hans Eberbach, commanding the remnants of Panzer Group West, reported that the concentrated artillery fire was so intense that bringing up reserves became impossible, evacuating the wounded couldn't be accomplished, and vehicle movement amounted to suicide. The road through Falaise became known as the Corridor of Death, a nightmare landscape of destroyed vehicles, dead horses, and abandoned equipment that created obstacles slowing movement and making subsequent units even more vulnerable to additional time-on-target strikes. By the 21st of August, when the pocket finally closed completely, 50,000 German soldiers had been captured and 10,000 killed. Artillery accounted for the majority of casualties, a proportion unprecedented in modern warfare where infantry combat typically dominated casualty statistics. As German forces retreated toward the Seine in late August, they discovered that even river crossings offered no respite from time-on-target barrages. American forward observers had infiltrated ahead of main forces, establishing hidden positions overlooking every potential crossing site along the river. At Vernon, Rouen and Mantes, German attempts to establish pontoon bridges were met with immediate time-on-target responses. The precision achieved was remarkable. Bridges were destroyed while still under construction, often with engineer units actively working on them when the coordinated barrage arrived. The systematic destruction of crossing attempts through precisely timed artillery demonstrated the technique's flexibility and the thorough way Americans had integrated it into standard operations. German units began refusing to attempt crossings in daylight, creating massive traffic jams on the western banks that became targets for additional time-on-target missions. By December 1944, Americans had integrated new technologies that made time on target even more devastating. The VT fuse, officially designated variable time but universally known as the proximity fuse, was first employed in ground artillery during the Battle of the Bulge. These revolutionary fuses used miniature radar systems to detect the ground and detonate shells at optimal height above the surface for maximum fragment dispersion. When VT-fused shells were incorporated into time-on-target barrages from December 1944 onward, lethality increased dramatically. Shells detonating at optimal height created uniform patterns of destruction that no foxhole or slit trench could provide protection against. Over 22 million proximity fuses were produced during the war, transforming artillery effectiveness in the conflict's final months. The Germans initially believed Americans had developed an entirely new type of weapon. Intelligence reports speculated about controlled aerial mines or sophisticated time-delay cluster munitions. The truth that it was simply precise timing combined with proximity fuses seemed almost too straightforward for such devastating effect. As American forces approached the Siegfried Line in September 1944, German commanders believed their fortifications would finally provide protection from time-on-target barrages. The concrete bunkers and steel cupolas had been designed specifically to withstand sustained artillery bombardment, lessons learned from the Great War incorporated into defensive architecture. The Americans developed specialized time-on-target missions specifically for attacking fortifications. By combining instant-impact high-explosive shells with delayed fuse armor-piercing projectiles, they achieved simultaneous surface explosions and penetrating impacts in unified strikes. At Geilenkirchen in November, the 84th Infantry Division faced extensive Siegfried Line fortifications that had been prepared over years. The attacking units called for a time-on-target mission from 12 battalions, 144 guns, firing carefully calculated mixtures of ammunition types. The coordinated impact achieved what weeks of conventional bombardment had failed to accomplish, creating breaches through which infantry could assault. During the German Ardennes offensive in December 1944, time on target proved its value in defensive operations under the most challenging circumstances. Though initially caught off guard by the unexpected German attack through terrain considered unsuitable for major operations, American artillery units quickly recovered and began delivering time-on-target missions on German spearheads. On the 19th of December, as the 2nd Panzer Division approached Dinant in what represented the deepest German penetration, forward observers from the 3rd Armoured Division called for emergency time-on-target support. Within 4 minutes, 8 battalions had calculated firing solutions and were ready to fire. The resulting barrage caught the German column on the march, destroying the lead battalion within 60 seconds and halting the entire division's advance. The ability to mass fires quickly through time on target proved crucial in containing German penetrations that might otherwise have achieved more significant results. At Bastogne, surrounded American forces called for time-on-target missions danger close to their own positions, coordinates carefully calculated to devastate German assault formations attempting to breach the perimeter while avoiding friendly casualties. As American forces approached the Rhine in March 1945, time-on-target techniques reached their zenith of destructive capability. The crossing operations were supported by massive artillery concentrations employing time-on-target principles on a scale previously unimaginable. At the Wesel crossing on the 24th of March 1945, the Allies concentrated 4,000 guns, with 2,070 American pieces participating in the bombardment. The opening bombardment lasted 4 hours, with coordinated time-on-target strikes at 15-minute intervals throughout that period. Each strike involved hundreds of guns achieving unified impact across kilometre-wide target areas. The scale exceeded anything previously attempted in warfare. In preparation for the Rhine crossing, American artillery fired over 65,000 tons of ammunition in March 1945 alone, more than entire armies had fired in previous wars' major campaigns. German defenders reported that bombardment intensity reached levels where concussion alone caused casualties. Soldiers were found dead without any visible wounds, killed by overpressure from shells exploding in such concentration that the atmosphere itself became a weapon. At Oppenheim, where Patton's Third Army crossed on the 22nd of March, the supporting time-on-target barrage involved 33 battalions, over 400 guns, firing in perfect coordination. The barrage lasted precisely 60 seconds and delivered 10,000 shells onto German positions defending the crossing site. German commanders reported that entire battalions simply ceased to exist as fighting formations. There weren't even survivors to report what had happened, positions simply going silent on communication nets without any word of their fate. What German officers gradually recognized through bitter experience was that time on target represented the application of American industrial management methods to warfare itself. The same principles that enabled Detroit to produce a bomber every hour enabled American artillery to coordinate hundreds of guns with clockwork precision. This industrial approach extended well beyond the battlefield. American factories produced artillery shells in staggering quantities, over 8 million rounds monthly by late 1944. The transportation system, from ports through supply depots to firing batteries, delivered these shells in continuous flow. Communication networks coordinated this vast enterprise with business-like efficiency foreign to traditional military culture. The psychological trauma inflicted by time on target extended far beyond immediate casualties and physical destruction. German medical services documented unprecedented rates of combat neurosis specifically linked to experiencing coordinated bombardment. Veterans who'd endured hours-long Soviet barrages on the Eastern Front, men who'd survived Stalingrad and Kursk, found time on target qualitatively different. The instantaneous nature removed all psychological coping mechanisms soldiers had developed. There was no escalation to prepare mentally for increased intensity. There was no rhythm to anticipate and adjust to. There was no pattern to recognize and find comfort in familiarity. German field hospitals reported soldiers experiencing multiple times on target barrages exhibited unique symptoms. Paralysis triggered by sudden sounds, particularly multiple simultaneous sounds. Inability to process multiple stimuli, becoming overwhelmed when confronted with more than one thing happening at once. Profound fear of synchronicity itself, becoming terrified when events seemed coordinated. Unlike traditional shell shock, which might improve with rest behind the lines, these symptoms persisted even after evacuation to rear areas far from combat. Some soldiers never recovered their psychological equilibrium, remaining institutionalized for years after the war ended. Fritz Bayerlein's assessment, delivered after Operation Cobra, became the most frequently quoted German description of experiencing time on target. His front lines looked like the surface of the moon, he reported, and at least 70% of his troops were casualties of one sort or another, whether dead, wounded, driven insane, or simply too psychologically numbed to function as soldiers. General Hans Eberbach provided equally crucial testimony about the technique's impact. The fire curtain created by coordinated American artillery was so dense that bringing up reserves proved impossible, evacuating wounded couldn't be accomplished, and any movement drew instant annihilation. The Americans had developed a system of artillery concentration that exceeded anything German military professionals had imagined possible. Captured documents from Wehrmacht headquarters revealed desperate attempts to develop countermeasures against American time-on-target capabilities. A report from the Weapons Testing Office concluded bleakly that American coordinated fire technique represented technological superiority in computational devices and communication integration, and that no effective countermeasure existed within current German capabilities. German attempts to replicate time-on-target techniques revealed systemic disadvantages that couldn't be overcome through tactical skill or individual courage. German artillerists understood the underlying mathematics and could calculate time of flight as accurately as their American counterparts. But they lacked everything else necessary. They lacked standardized ammunition that performed consistently. They lacked reliable communications networks connecting all available artillery. They lacked trained personnel in sufficient numbers. Most fundamentally, they lacked the industrial foundation that made American coordinated fire practically achievable rather than merely theoretically possible. German attempts at coordinated fire typically involved no more than 3 or 4 batteries and achieved only approximate simultaneity, with shells arriving dispersed over several seconds. The largest German attempt during the Nordwind offensive in January 1945 involved 8 batteries but achieved impact dispersion over 12 seconds, far from the precision Americans routinely achieved. As American forces drove into Germany proper in early 1945, time-on-target barrages became routine preliminaries to virtually any attack. At Cologne, the garrison commander surrendered after experiencing a single 60-second time-on-target barrage on the 5th of March, reporting to higher headquarters that further resistance was militarily pointless against such overwhelming artillery superiority. The pattern repeated across the collapsing Reich. Commanders who'd fought tenaciously for years, veterans of multiple campaigns who'd never considered surrender, capitulated after experiencing brief time-on-target bombardments. The psychological effect had become so pronounced that often the mere threat of coordinated fire prompted surrender negotiations. Soviet observers studied American time-on-target techniques with intense interest, recognizing immediately their potential value for Red Army operations. The British, despite being allies, proved equally impressed by what Americans had achieved. Field Marshal Montgomery wrote in his post-war memoirs that American time-on-target demonstrated warfare had become fundamentally a matter of industrial and organizational superiority, with traditional military virtues of courage, discipline, and tactical skill becoming secondary to systematic application of overwhelming firepower. The German experience with time-on-target fundamentally influenced post-war military thinking worldwide. When the Bundeswehr was established in 1955, coordinated fire capability became a primary requirement for its artillery forces, explicitly citing wartime experience with American techniques as justification. The French École de Guerre revised its entire artillery curriculum based on German accounts of American time on target. Israeli Defense Forces, established in 1948, incorporated time-on-target principles from the beginning, advised by Jewish American veterans who'd served in artillery units during the war. NATO doctrine explicitly incorporated time-on-target principles, viewing coordinated fires as essential for defeating numerically superior Warsaw Pact forces. General Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe fighter ace who later served as NATO Military Committee chairman, stated in 1968 that the lesson of American time on target remained clear decades later. Qualitative superiority in synchronization and coordination could defeat quantitative superiority in personnel and equipment. The computational methods developed for time on target laid groundwork for modern military technologies that would emerge in subsequent decades. The graphical firing tables and rapid calculation methods pioneered by American artillery units during World War II presaged computerized fire control systems that would revolutionize artillery effectiveness in later conflicts. The story of German forces encountering American time-on-target artillery marks a pivotal moment in military history, the transformation of warfare from an art practiced by warriors into a science executed by systems. German soldiers, products of what many considered the world's most professional military tradition, found themselves defeated not by superior tactical brilliance or individual courage, but by industrial efficiency applied with mathematical precision to the ancient art of artillery. American time on target shattered the entire conceptual framework within which traditional military thinking operated. The coordinated thunder that fell on German positions throughout 1944 and 1945 announced the arrival of a fundamentally new age in warfare, where victory would belong to those who could most effectively transform military operations into industrial processes executed with systematic precision. The echoes of that thunder still resonate in military doctrine worldwide. Every modern artillery system, every networked military force, every coordinated military operation conducted today owes something to the revolution that American time on target represented during World War II. The German soldiers who experienced time on target bombardment were witnesses to the birth of a new age in human conflict, where industrial mathematics would prove more powerful than martial tradition, where coordination would triumph over courage, where systems would defeat soldiers. In the age of industrial warfare that time on target exemplified, organization triumphs over individual valor, systems defeat soldiers regardless of their skill, and coordinated timing conquers all traditional military virtues. The Germans learned this lesson under the instant, overwhelming thunder of American industrial warfare made manifest in perfectly coordinated artillery fire, a lesson that transformed the nature of warfare forever and continues to shape how militaries think about combat in the modern era.